So I'm going to be talking to you about exciting topics like data. Now, don't go to sleep. It's an important topic, data. I particularly want to talk about my experiences of a project called FAIRDOM, which is all about how to manage the exchange of knowledge, actually, as Cameron was mentioning. I'm also, as was mentioned, part of Elixir. So I seem to live in this infrastructure world for a living. So we've all had pummeled on us open science, open data, reproducible science, personally productive science, which is how I prefer to think of open science rather than shouting at people to make their data open. Think about how they can make themselves more productive. Here's another little handy booklet just produced by the European Union for you to all read. And of course, you have your own Norway's contribution to this plethora of documents, open access to research data, which is now being proposed as recommendations in the Norwegian system. So within this environment, I've been running a project now for 10 years, this July actually, called FAIRDOM. And FAIRDOM is about findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable data, operations, and models. It was particularly set up in order to be able to support systems biology and synthetic biology projects. So it isn't just about data, it's about other things. It's to do with process and it's to do with models as well. To be very practical about how to address openness and sharing and collaboration and support personal productivity as well as transparency and many of the things about overcoming boundaries between members of particular communities, particular research groups, and between those groups in large-scale projects and programs. And so I'm going to open up by giving you some background about why this came about and why it is the way it is. Give you some information about FAIRDOM in case you don't know, though I can't possibly imagine why you wouldn't. And then also to give three areas of where I've learned something about trust as well as running this activity. So why was this set up? It was set up by funders, actually. It was set up by a series of programs, the Euronets, and then other networks, and now Eurocobiotech is coming on stream. And the idea was that they were going to invest in a lot of research. They wanted to be able to foster better stewardship amongst the people doing the research, to stimulate sharing, to ensure that there was retention of the results after the projects so that they could then answer the treasury, whoever given the money to that organisation, what did you do with it? Where did it go? Where is the accountability to those taxpayers that actually funded the research? But also that they wanted us to, as people who've been brought in order to be able to assist in this process, to respect global community and local project resources as well. There is an entire talk, which I'm not going to give, about how we were brought in to do this 1 year after the project had started, and to say it was a poisoned chalice is not being too exaggerated, but that requires drinking to be able to tell all the stories of that. So we won't do that. Part of the reason is because of this kind of thing, that model reuse and reproducibility is extremely difficult and people don't share. Actually, people tend to share models, but they don't tend to share data. And so we did a survey actually as part of the ISBE project, another research infrastructure, that found, this won't surprise many of you, that there isn't enough metadata associated with most models in order that they can ever be reused or even be reproduced, particularly around parameters. Parameters are the least well-described area. And I think that Jasper is going to be talking about that immediately after me. He has a cunning plan of how to improve that. So what we were operating in these projects is two things. One, an ecosystem of resources. So we have, on the one hand, people operating in their own projects with their own shared file systems, their own, perhaps, databases, but mainly just putting things on hard disks. And on the other side, we have a trusted collection of public collections and archives run by data centers, journals, institutional repositories, which we have many of which were mentioned yesterday. How do we bridge this? How do we actually move things across from the research groups when they produce their results into these institutional repositories and these public repositories? And how do we also enable them to be able to link their research to those items as well, those communities, those particular repositories? The second we were operating in was an ecosystem. So this ecosystem is multidisciplinary teams, multi-site collaborations, who are all pretending to collaborate but actually internally competing. Experimentalists with dry modelers who are required to self-deposit and self-curate, but have variable stewardship skills. And I'm sure you can all recognise yourselves in there. So that's what we're actually operating in. And so part of the challenge, and I think Cameron maybe hinted towards this, is stakeholder accountability values. That on the one hand, that the values of journals and the values of the funders are slightly different to the values of those actually executing the research, which is, so the researchers are interested in productivity, in doing science with collaborators, in getting credit, in retention of results once the student has left and you've discovered you've got to redo some of their analysis in order to be able to get that paper out after all, versus public good. So preparing things for the public good, where things will be shared with not colleagues, but with rivals. So that's quite an interesting dilemma to operate. So in order to be able to do this, what we decided to do was, first of all, to make everything fair. And the project has been going 10 years, but it's only been called FAIRDOM for 5 years. Because before that it was called SysmoDB, because we were associated with the Sysmo database, a Sysmo system. But luckily we wrote a paper called Fair Principles and changed our name to FAIRDOM. And FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. That's what it stands for. And it has two aspects to it. The first is technical. So the whole FAIR Principles is about how do I collect metadata that's machine processable? How do I collect and keep clean identifiers and deal with identifiers? And what are your access policies and licenses? That's in a nutshell. So I've saved you reading the paper now. But that's basically what it's about. But actually, it's been an enormously powerful political meme. That's been its most useful thing, I would say, because most people haven't read the paper, so they don't actually know it's about machine processable metadata. They just know about the word fair. But it's useful nonetheless. And the second thing was to improve knowledge flow. So that was to deal with the fact that people, we wanted to be able to get communities, these projects to share amongst themselves, to share between each other, and also as they deposited data into this fragmented ecosystem of repositories, which was very tied to the type of data rather than the integration of those different data types in an experimental context. In order to be able to do that, we would try to pull everything together in a commons to draw together the scattered resources and to sponsor collaboration. And a commons is effectively a collective, a place where the resources are gathered together for a particular community. Now this picture here on the side was drawn by a guy called Josh Summer. And I was inspired when Cameron was mentioning his presentation. Josh Summer is a cancer survivor who's a young man who has chordoma, actually. He's currently in remission. And he set up a commons to share research data around chordoma. And that's because there was no flow of data between researchers, and there were such few researchers. He's made more progress than all the other research funders put together, just because he was so highly motivated. So to quickly move on, so FAIRDOM, here's a cloud of our logos. Yay. What a FAIRDOM is it's a mixture of social, process, and software platforms. So the software platform I'll show you a little bit about it in a minute, for being able to do this data management and model management and so on. It's about stewardship support, so it has social aspects to it. And it's about processes, trying to understand what is it that researchers actually need and do, and being able to support that. And we also do a lot of policy, advocacy, and community work as well. We currently have 90 projects on our central hub, and at least 30 private installations, because our platform falls into two parts, and it comes in two flavors. The first part is a hub, which is a collaborative place for being able to organize your data and be able to share it amongst your colleagues and across projects and across programs. And at the back end, there is the on-site data storage where we have all the samples data, and where you have your pipelines and you have your LIMS systems and so on. And we link the two together. And in particular, in the Norwegian situation, we have this Norwegian e-infrastructure for life sciences that Elixir Norway sponsor, which we have linked our platform to. So our two flavors are, you can take that software platform and you can install it yourself and run your own hub, or you can use a public hub, which is called FAIRDOM Hub, which is hosted at Heidelberg and has an institutional guarantee, so it's a trusted resource, and so it'll be there at least to 2029, and then we're extending the legal warranties beyond that. So trust is, for data, is do I trust it will still be there? Does that repository still exist? And many of the things that Elixir does, along with Inga and myself, is to try to make sure that the repositories that I talked about that are in that ecosystem will survive. So where you put your data will actually continue to exist. So to quickly hop through what this kind of thing looks like, here is, it's about managing projects, people, and assets. So I say assets, not data, in order to be able to bring in models and samples and other kinds of things. So here's Digital Salmon. This is its project space. You can upload or you can link to data held remotely. So it's a one-place catalogue, and it's linked to other systems. So I'll give a little bit more of an explanation of that shortly. Here's two of the projects that are in the Digital Salmon program, so it's organised as programs and projects. Here's John Olaf, who is a poster boy for the system, is a champion. He's been remarkably supportive and puts lots of data in the central hub. But this is also not just saying, here's some data, it's here are the people who produced the data, and that's all part of the trust aspects of the environment. The system is organised around ISA structure, investigation, study, and assay, which means that you can have quite a rigorous way of organising your metadata so that you can navigate around quite complicated collections. And the important thing here is that the models, the data, presentations, and so on are all organised and interlinked through this structure. So it's a structured organisation that handles versions and things like this. So it's not just for final results, it's for results as you are proceeding in the project. And secondly, that those results can be held in third-party places. They can be held on your file store, for example, the NEAL system. They can be uploaded locally to the hub, but they can also be held in third-party repositories like the JWS Online Model or biomodels or whatever, and then pointed to. Now that raises issues to do with, I've now built a catalogue that spans repositories, and will those repositories still be trusted? But let's put that to one side. And then this is an indication of how you can organise the metadata at the top, and then link to your file store in a local infrastructure, for example, NEALS. So it gives some idea of this working in an ecosystem. Of course, this is all massively linked metadata. And when Cameron was talking, I was thinking that the metadata here is all about boundary concepts and boundary knowledge, that the metadata is absolutely fundamental because it's the way, we've got this very elaborate way of describing and organizing the resources, but without standardized terms, without this structure of investigation, study, assay, without using the standards of the community, it's extremely difficult to understand what's in there. So this is absolutely critical. We do a lot of standards work in organizations like Combine and so on. Another important thing is this whole system was designed by our pals. And pals were representatives, and still are representatives, of projects. This is the first group of pals. They designed the system. When we started this project, the idea, we were told by our funders, was to build a database, one database. And the first meeting we had with these people who were all postdocs and PhD students from different projects was not to build a database, but to build a catalogue of standard operating procedures, to build a yellow pages, and to do some really kick-ass spreadsheet tooling. That's what they wanted. And so that's what we gave them. Gosh, 5 minutes. I've got 8 here. So this is the kind of questions that they were asking us to answer. So an example of transparent publication, which was also mentioned by Cameron, is this paper here by a colleague in South Africa, which shows that this paper is backed by 16 data files, 19 models, 13 standard operating procedures, and so on. And this is their entry on the hub. So this, again, has organized the materials in a structured way, which is effectively backing for that paper. Importantly, it's both living and snapshotted. So that's a living entry, but there's also a snapshotted entry here with a DOI. And that DOI is what is actually wired to the publication, because that says, at this point of the publication, this is what we knew. But since then, more things have happened. So now we're able to say, are you able to defend that paper? Yes, by this material. But we continue to do more. Okay, so that's an important aspect of it. And we can also bundle all of this up into a package and deposit it for long-term preservation independently in a repository like Zenodo that's associated with many journals. So, looking at that particular paper, I can download that process. This is a standard operating procedure. I've got the people who get the credit for it. The model can be reproduced. It's all been marked up in ZML, so it can be run and simulated in the actual browser of the platform itself. So this is true reproducibility. You'll notice I jumped to a different example than from John Olaf. And that's a reason, because this is the Digicel entry, and it has a whole bunch of stuff, none of it visible to the public. It's all private. And there's a reason for that. So I'm not getting at John Olaf here, it's perfectly reasonable, but it's within his own community that he's sharing. It's not open science, not public science, because he hasn't quite got round to that. And so that comes to my 3 points about trust, accountability, and tragedy of the commons that I've come as I've built this system. On resourcing, on behaviours, and adoption. So my first rant, which will be short, is funding, resourcing. Software and data are free, like free puppies. So a puppy, when you get a puppy that's free, it's not a one-off cost, because puppies need to be managed and looked after and walked and fed, and they get ill and they eventually die. And so does software. And so does data, actually. So I've lost count of the number of times that funding councils have said, but we already gave you the money for that, as if that was it. So this is the economics of data infrastructures needs brave new funding models. And one-off capitalization isn't it. So that's the first thing that is my trust. Do I trust my funders? The second is behaviours of looking at this hub. Because I have 90 projects, I have 900 people on this hub, at the public hub. The private ones I can't speak to so much. The private ones are often set up where people are really nervous about sharing, or they want highly customised implementations, typically in synthetic biology labs. What do you see? There's these individual spaces, the one that I showed you for Digicel and so on, where you can protect yourself. So you can say, I have things, but you can't see them. So we get what we call enclave sharing. So that's sharing amongst neighbours. Exactly the thing that Cameron was mentioning. You share amongst your indigenous population, as it were. We have tribal sharing. I wrote that slide before I heard what Cameron was saying. Modelers and data providers, or data scientists, experimentalists rather, share in different ways. Modelers come from the software engineering community. Typically, they have a software background. They share because they're used to open science and open development. Experimentalists don't like to share so much. There's a lot of hoarding, hugging, flirting, where you have put just enough metadata on it to make it interesting, but not enough to use it, so that somebody then has to put you on their paper to be able to use it. Dowries, where we can tell when somebody's about to try to move group because they try to make all their data invisible again, because then they can take it as a dowry to the new group. That doesn't work, by the way. There's all sorts of consortia pressures. Very organised consortia are much less likely to share than loosely organised consortia. Credits, people are very bad at crediting data, despite the fact we have DOIs on things. So there's a problem of asymmetrical reciprocity, which is, I want to take it, but I don't want to credit you. And that's an issue. So what we have is this very elaborate permissions system in the FAIRDOM hub with negotiated access and embargoes and stage sharing and private walled gardens. But as Jürgen says, actually being open can sometimes lead to good things, but there is a tendency to be a bit closed. And what happens is exactly what Cameron said. You end up with this spiral that in the middle there is me and my colleagues and my friends, and we'll share, but the further you go out of the spiral, the greater the reach to strangers, the number of assets that you want to make available reduces, the richness of metadata increases, because now you can't guarantee that you have commonality because you are going beyond the boundaries of your immediate colleagues. So that's a challenge as well. So we can see this effect. Another tragedy is metadata. This is from an article, a blog by Mark Moosen, who is part of the NIH Data Commons. And his particular gripe is that we're going to be building all these commons like the NIH Data Commons, but the quality of the metadata is too weak in order to be able to really be able to discover things beyond what you already knew from people you already knew. And that's because of value systems. So value systems and sweatshops. So the value of preparing for assets, the value of reproducibility, the value of metadata, the priorities of public good versus personal good. And that is because we are all operating, and I certainly am operating in a sweatshop. Because how many papers are you producing? Have you met your milestones? And so on. So I work with a particular group who's completely obsessed about just their nature papers. And they never set aside the time to actually do the data management because it isn't their priority. Although when, of course, they come to publish, they need the data. And then it becomes a priority. But it's a bit late by then because it takes this kind of debt. There is a debt to producing good quality, shareable results. So that's an issue. And in order to be able to avoid that debt, what we need to do is what Peter calls fair by design. I called born fair, or fair ramps, things that enable us to be able to gather fair metadata by automated processes or by us not even noticing. So I produced a system called Rightfield, which is this kick-ass spreadsheeting that we were asked for by our pals that basically smuggles in rich metadata, rich annotations, but it looks like you're just using a spreadsheet. So this is a way of being able to get, at the point of collection, rich metadata, but without unbalancing the workflows of the people who are already very stressed in what they're trying to do. And actually, Peter's then going to, Jasper is going to talk about this a bit further on. Peter as well, no doubt, but Jasper in particular. And the third area, so I'm coming to an end, is people. We need stewards. We're very short of stewards. It's a specialist skill. They don't have very good career pathways. Curation and management needs to be supported. They need to be trusted as well. It's quite difficult for us to go into groups and to be kind of not treated as first-class citizens. So we really respect our pals and we really respect our curators and we really respect our stewards. But sometimes the projects themselves don't do that, particularly principal investigators. So I'm just looking at you all now to see who's gone red, because it does actually, they need support. They need to be beyond tolerated. And here we have some examples of where I have some hope, because we have people like Maxim and Alexander and Fatima, who are excellent stewards, who have been with me in, at least in 2 cases, in a whole bunch of projects. And it's kind of a new era of people who are capable of doing this kind of metadata work, capable of doing stewardship, capable of being able to bleed it into groups through various different projects that we've been associated with. So I'm optimistic. So my summary is, how do we overcome the tragedy of the commons? We overcome it by processes becoming embedded and being recognised by the projects, by ramps, by trying to bleed in metadata collection into our technologies, by stewardship professionalisation, I think, and by defeating cultural inertia. So it's social, process, and technology again, which I think actually partially echoes, particularly the social parts, what Cameron was saying. And my last comment is I've produced a commons, and a commons production, so producing things for a shared commons, there are only 4 incentives in the entire world for that, which comes from economic theory. In fact, the guy who came up with this just got the Nobel Prize for economics, Richard Thaler. And these are fame, love, money, and by side effect. So fame is you get your papers. Love is because you're scientists. Money is because you're going to get some funding, which is why you were so attentive and all came at 9 o'clock this morning. And by side effect is you're tricked into doing the right thing by doing something else you wanted to do. So my spreadsheet tooling is side effect. You're tricked into collecting rich ontologically marked up metadata because you thought you were filling out a spreadsheet, right? And I have lots of other tricks. It's called libertarian paternalism. And it's basically being sneaky. And so I ask you to think, what could you do sneakily to improve fair data in your lab? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I overran it.